Welcome to Mad Dog's Campfire. I love a good story. Here you'll find old stories. Not so old stories, and some I wrote myself. I would love it if you retold these stories around your own campfire. If you know a good story, pass it along. I'll do my best to put it here. If you'd like me to come tell stories at a festival or around your campfire, let me know. Maybe we can arrange something. My work is copyrighted. However, if you'd like to use it or reproduce it somewhere, I ask that you give my work credit. Link it or send a copy. I'd love to check it out. That said, move in close. The night is cold. Come warm yourself by my fire. The Bear Trap. Copyright 2022 by Dan Wright, Mad Dog. This story is about mountain men, Native Americans, and is a little bit graphic. Listen at your own discretion. The Bear Trap. Casey Mitchell sat in the chair for his yearly barbering. He should have felt grateful there was a barber that far west and in such a remote fort in Indian country. But every year the man talked and talked about his favorite subject. Some philosophical point about a man's actions and thoughts leaving a physical mark upon the person, identifiable if one was observant. Always bringing up Carrie's Wood, the old matron in the snake band of Shoshone, missing parts of 3 fingers. He'd always bring it up, saying it was because she lost 3 sons, as though that was a marvelous revelation. But anyone who understood the customs and practices of the heathens didn't find it worth remarking upon. Then he'd move on to the deep lines in the squaws' faces or some such thing. Maybe, Casey thought, they'd just been living more or less outdoors their entire lives, like savages. Of course they looked like hell's outcasts. Any time he said anything like that in response, the barber would animate, exclaiming that was his exact point and how marvelous it was that Casey had helped to make it, as though it was a point of agreement. The one thing the barber never seemed interested in was trapping, which, being Casey's profession, made the conversations curiously into monologues. Why couldn't the man shut up and attend to the shearing business? It would almost be a relief to be injured, maybe receiving a stitching, because then at least he could be plied with whiskey for the pain, and the man's eloquence could be tolerated. This other was only to be endured. Following the barbering, Casey spent the rest of the time in the fort bartering and trading pelts for supplies, horse flesh, gifts for the heathens, and foodstuffs. He insisted on the barbering before trading. His father, having been a banker, drilled into his impressionable son's head the need to be presentable in every way while transacting. When finally provisioned, Casey only lacked one thing, a partner. He'd been feeling the need to take on help. The supplies of furs were certainly plentiful. There were also the day-to-day chores that needed attending. A partner could even out the work. Besides, the Indians were a constant nuisance, trying to steal horses, aggressive without cause. A partner would be welcome when it came to fighting. Casey had been lucky so far, but luck was a chancy thing, bound to fade out altogether sometime or another. Relief came by the name of Carlos Jorgensen, or partner rather. Somewhere back east, and by some undivinable fashion, it had become the thing to do, to name children with Spanish spelling, meaning that for all the ethnic feeling of his name, Carlos was as white as any other Scandinavian. But he was eager and willing, and had come all the way to this god-forsaken outpost in spite of being named Carlos. That was probably resume enough. The dugout was a 1.5-week journey by horse through the Badlands, and then a steady climb into the high Uintahs of Utah territory. Why it was called that was anyone's guess. It was really Shoshone territory and Utes. Occasionally there would be hunting parties of Blackfeet from up north, best to be avoided, them and the Bloods. Both were prone to misunderstanding intentions and would react violently and remorselessly. The area, though, was heavy with game besides beaver, so the hunting traffic tended to be heavy. How the different tribes divided the area or avoided each other was anyone's guess. Maybe the need for food outweighed the risks. When they reached the dugout, Carlos had second thoughts for the first time, mostly about finding it again. for its placement was hidden and deep among the canyons and trees of an unremarkable mountain range. Unremarkable only in the sense there were few landmarks. Most of it was similar hills, thick copses of aspens and pines, broken by meadows that could be painted likenesses of one another, all at an altitude that made breathing strained. Occasionally there was a view worthy of the breathtaking, but mostly it just looked like its own surroundings. Nestled in a fold that was deeper and darker than most, Casey and Carlos set to work improving and preparing the dugout for an extended winter trapping season, when furs would be thickest. Carlos took the lead with the preparing, while Casey worked on the procuring and preserving of meat. One of Carlos's greatest achievements beyond stacking endless cords of firewood was the main cache. In the trees nearby and at a considerable height from the ground, he constructed a tight box for keeping critters out, accessible through a trap in the flooring after scaling a makeshift ladder of sorts. Inside it contained all that was edible, filling up steadily as Casey brought in smoked elk and dried fish, as well as dried mushrooms and berries. Meat could become tiresome when it was the only thing available. They both worked at the hide tanning. Elk and deer didn't fetch any price, really, but made the winter stay comfortable and warm. So they were systematically processed and stored inside the cabin. Once inside and prepared there, they went to another location, a week's journey through the mountains. Another cache was prepared, not so much a shelter, but food and more food, once again safely off the ground and secured. The season was turning, and the pelts would be thickening. Casey began instructing Carlos in the finer points of trapping as they traveled to yet another location to set up yet another cache. Neither would be as extensive as the dugout. Casey explained that they were more for resupplying at the end of a run. The return trip to the dugout from the second cache brought them in contact with Shoshone for the first time. In Carlos's mind, the moment was intense. Not knowing if they were friendly or fearsome, he expected things to go south in an instant. Casey, however, knew the brave kicking buck. After a smattering of sign and pigeon, both trappers went to the camp by escort. Having some trade goods upon their person was dumb luck, but the gifts eased any tensions and gained assurances of future trading. As the trappers neared the dugout, Carlos began recognizing the terrain. What at first seemed bewildering was now familiar. Casey's instruction proving valuable, Carlos proving an apt student. Upon arriving home, as it were, they noticed the trap under the cache had been sprung. It was a giant steel bear trap. They were careful to always leave one set at the base of each cache while away, the caution having proved out this time. Inside the trap was the giant pad of a black bear, having been chewed above the trap's bite and left clamped there. Blood coated everything. Tufts of hair stuck to it. The trail the bear took was clearly visible. It was denoted with blood and what can only be described as no stealth or grace. Both men puzzled about it for a while, until eventually chores needed doing and preparations for bed. Both men had settled to sleep outside of the dugout, next to the embers of the night's fire. Stars filled their gazes. "Casey, what that bear done that for?" Carlos spoke, breaking the mood. "The foot? Well, I believe it's like most critters. Wanting to live, it's all," came Casey's reply. "Maybe he was hungry." "But to gnaw it off, how'd he do it?" "Just chewed and chewed till he was free. You can see he tried chewing the chain first." "No, I mean, how could he go through with it?" "Oh, well, that's the easy part. Didn't have no choice in the matter. Some ways he was more sensible than a person. 'Cept people can see what needs doing and do it. Animals, though, that's all they knowed, what needs doing. I expect they have fewer options than men." "I can't imagine a man being in quite a state, chewing his own foot. How would that be?" "It'd be about the worst thing, I reckon. The only worst thing would be dying." "You ever seen something like that before?" "With animals, yeah, often enough. People..." They gazed at the stars, listening to night sounds. "My first season trapping, I was in the camp south. I was green. They brought a captive woman in, all tied up. She was screaming and cursing in Apache or some such language I never knowed for certain. But she was spitting and squalling something that night. Somehow that night, she worked a hand loose and got her feet free. Come daybreak, she rolled under the teepee edge and run off. They didn't think much of her and sent some young men after her. They were itchy to count coup on an enemy and become braves. Wouldn't have been much honor in it, being a girl and all. But by gum, she killed 2 of the 3. Third one, he shot a couple arrows in her, so she was really wounded. Then he tied her behind the horse and dragged her back to camp. She was a bloody haunch when she arrived. The 2 she killed were brothers. Old Carrieswood cut the ends of her fingers off, 1 for each son. That made 3 at the time. I never heard such carryings on as before or since. The whole tribe was in an uproar. Was it a fearful thing? Oh yes, fearful. I joined in on the morning. I had to. They was looking to take out their grief somehow. Gave all my trade goods up. Seemed sensible. Cut my face too and wailed. Weren't no way I was going to cut no finger though. We kind of both did what we had to. Me and that girl. Her escaping and me joining in the bedlam. Both trying to survive. Not much different than the bear. Carlos got up and retrieved another elk hide from the cabin. The embers were about out. Nights cooler as the season changed. What happened to the girl? They carved chunks from her, boiled and ate it in front of her. Then they forced her to eat some, and then they killed her. Wicked, mean savages really know how to break someone. Seasons changed and snow began falling. Often it was a short-lived shower that just left a dusting. The sun would warm it to mud. The sky loomed with greater threatenings. Ice crusted in the waterways. Both men worked in the cold, crunching ice, setting traps. They were setting a set of beaver dams when, in an instant, 4 wild braves rode from the trees. Casey was shot full of arrows. He screamed as he fell face first in the water. The foremost rider splashing up to the corpse and falling from the horse to take the body. With undulating cries, he counted coup and began removing the trapper's pelt from his head. Carlos began to run the instant he realized the threat and was spared the sight. He escaped. His escape was cut short when horses and men caged him. He stopped running and the braves laughed. It was a day and more when they arrived at the Shoshone camp. Carlos had been tied and run behind the horses the whole way. When he floundered and stumbled, the Bloods would yell at him and ride up to deliver kicks wherever one would land. The Shoshone purchased Carlos for a spotted Appaloosa horse. The Bloods left Richard with permission to hunt the territory. Carlos remained and was treated as a useful dog. He was given to the oldest woman in the camp, some crone, half blind and missing fingers. He soon realized his purpose was to aid the woman in the obligations she had, her age and blindness having made her a burden. Carlos understood none of their tongue. The beatings and pantomimes, though, were impossible to misunderstand. In spite of her blindness, the witch could land a blow with a stick all too often. Carlos was made to do woman's work, toting firewood, fleshing hides, bringing water, and adjusting and fixing teepees, all with an expected alacrity and skill. Failing either earned him more punishment. In the 3 weeks he remained there as a prisoner, he paid attention to everything, from the camp's rhythm to any relationship he could puzzle out. He noticed things while trying to be unnoticed himself. Nightly, 4 or 5 young men stood outside the same teepee wrapped in blankets. He understood their gestures of courting. He only glimpsed the maid once. No great beauty to his eyes. He was unsure why she was such an attraction. There was an older brave. Carlos knew no names, but called him Wolfman. Everywhere he went, he wore a wolf's pelt. It draped behind him like a cape. He also had a necklace of wolf teeth. Carlos saw old wounds that looked like dog bites. The man limped. Their horses were hobbled more than corralled. Nightly 2 warriors kept watch on the horses in camp. They slept most of the day. They were required to do little outside the night watch. The crone he lived with seemed sad. When he got a good look, it was 3 fingers missing their first knuckle. Carlos decided the reason she was blind was because she insisted on cooking indoors. The smoke was constantly making his eyes water and he'd cough, then choke. What would a life of that much smoke do to you? Make a body blind, he concluded. He watched and waited. doing whatever he was told to avoid trouble. What he assumed were scouts returned every few days to report the news. They came and went regularly. He watched the directions they went. The altitude they camped at began to get downright cold at night. Mornings brought frost. The colored leaves blanketed the ground, fading vibrancy. Only during the night was Carlos bound. His freedom during the day allowed him to hide a piece of flaked chert just under the teepee edge. It was an unassuming night when Carlos escaped, cutting his restraints with the chert. He left without food and without much in the way of clothing. He went uphill, reasoning his escapees would likely move downhill. He hid the first chance he got in a hollow log. He lay there until the sun went down the next day, then went by night deeper into the mountains. He never encountered pursuers. He didn't doubt they were hunting him, though. He reached the nearest cache during the first snowstorm. It came down steadily, blanketing everything. He tore into the foodstuffs until he vomited. Though the night was the most bitter he had experienced, he passed it in comfort with a warm fire, a full belly, and an elk hide. With morning came the idea that if he could make the dugout, he'd be safe. He could at minimum winter in it quite comfortably. Gathering what supplies he could manage, he set out right away, returning to the dugout with horses. Had taken a week with many scouting detours. He aimed to do it in less time. He had no knife, no gun, and could only carry so much on his own back. Getting to the dugout had to be his biggest effort. It had to be almost mid-November now. The winter storms were late to arrive, but would undoubtedly come. The trek to the dugout was unremarkable, other than he did it in 3 days. He also saw little in the way of deer and elk. They had moved to lower elevations, away from the deepest snows that were due. He heard wolves twice, distant. Snow fell in earnest once he reached the dugout. It seemed to never stop. The path from the dugout door to the cache, to the woodpile, to the privy, cut deep into the snow. Either side were lined with snow walls above his chest. The only spot of warmth on the whole mountain was inside the dugout. Carlos moved the stores from the cache inside the dugout to eliminate at least one trip outdoors, also to help him judge his rationing. It helped to see what food he had. He figured his best case scenario would be 12 weeks being snowbound, 16 at worst. What was in the cache was obviously supposed to be supplemented by trapping. It's possible Casey would have changed their plans with snow that deep. Carlos had been planning to learn from the man's experience. Now he was gone. Carlos could only hope to survive. There would be no trapping. He only had vague notions about snowshoes and other winter comforts. He feared the Indians. Every time Carlos went outside for something and came back frozen and wet. He hated being wet. He had made improvements to his clothing so as to be warmer, but wet seemed his natural state. As the weeks crawled by in darkness mostly, a strange mindset overtook him. Being alone in the silent snow, he began obsessing about his food. There was also a constant drip, drip, drip from the roof. This annoyed him. The warm interior was the culprit, melting the underlayer of snow on the roof. What at first seemed like annoyances became overwhelming irritants. Old-timers called it cabin fever. His food ran out at 12 weeks. He fasted. He boiled hides and drank the broth. His mind obsessed about his hunger like it obsessed about his once food. He took the measure of his situation in the lessening, rational moments, hoping for just a snap thaw, a chance to flee the cabin into the Badlands. If he could only have a chance to make the fort, things would be all right. But the hunger, it kept gnawing away his humanity. The barber saw the silhouette of what appeared to be a haunt standing in his doorway. With a slow shuffle on a crutch, the ragged man made his way to the chair. He was wearing elk hides, but gaunt, specter-like. A hardness edged across his phantasmic face. When he smiled at the barber, he seemed a ghoul. Propping half a leg on a stool, he winced some. "Name's Carlos. Need your attention, son." The barber removed bloody wrappings to see the stump end. Sure, he clicked his tongue. "I'll stitch you up. I'll need to boil some water first. Get to that in a minute. I have some whiskey around here somewhere. Here, take a pull on that. the barber said, handing him a bottle. Mind telling me what happened to your leg? Nah, I don't think I have the stomach to tell what I did with it. How about you tell me what happened to it? The barber looked Carlos over for a long while, looking for the mark left upon the man. I reckon, he said with deep sympathy, the only worst thing would be dying. This concludes the bear trap. I hope you enjoyed.